Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going into this season and how travel is one of the big time things that is kind of being introduced for a number of different teams that is going to be really more aggressive than it ever has been and definitely will play a big time part in this upcoming season. But let's get into the players that just have to make the most of their fall camp. There are so many players across the country for so many contenders that you need to hit. You need to have big time camps going into a big time fall, and we'll break down those players. We'll get into Texas, Georgia, Oregon, and Ohio State today. We'll get into plenty more throughout the week. I can promise you that because there are a ton of players to break down. There's no two ways about that. But let's get into this real quick, and I want to start over. Oh, excuse me. I want to start over in Texas. And I'm going to start with Alfred Collins. Frankly, I think this might be the most important player on the defensive side of the ball for Texas this upcoming year. I think when you look at this team, they lost T'Vondre Sweat. They lost Byron Murphy. They are not getting those two guys back. I can promise you, Vernon Broughton and Alfred Collins, I think, are both really good players. And frankly, I think are going to be a more than fine duo for them in the middle. But they are not those two people. They are not T'Vondre Sweat. They are not Byron Murphy. And they're going to have to figure out a way to kind of the way that Josh Pate put it, I believe yesterday, was a Moneyball quote. You got to recreate them in the aggregate. You can't necessarily do it all at once. You're not going to have two players that just plug in and become T'Vondre Sweat and become Byron Murphy. But you can figure it out with a number of different players. So Alfred Collins is just a piece of this. You really have to have the entire defensive tackle group come along pretty well throughout this fall camp. But Alfred Collins is the guy that I just think is going to be a really, really good player if everything clicks. His athleticism is absolutely off the charts. More of that Byron Murphy type player that can be a little bit more rangy, a little bit more athletic, more of a pass rusher, absolutely, from that defensive tackle position. So I do think he's one of those guys that just holds a lot of power for this team. When you look at the defensive tackle position, you don't just need Vernon Broughton, who has had a number of really good reviews throughout the first couple of days in fall camp, and I expect to be a big-time player for them this year. I think Collins is the one that really opens a ton of different doors. He's the one that totally makes this defense pretty much what they were a year ago. They're not going to be a top 3 run defense, I can almost promise you that, but absolutely can be much better than people expect them to be, and I think Alfred Collins would play a huge part in that. And then when you look at the back end of this defense, Javion Cole is someone that I'm watching very, very closely. He came over from San Jose State, as you can see, had 7 picks while he was there, and is definitely someone that they're going to have big time snaps from throughout the season. And a lot of this stuff is going to be very interesting because the way Texas is lining up on the back end is changing pretty consistently. There's no real rhyme or reason, at least as of right this second, for how they're going about business on the back end, and we don't exactly know who's going to be a starter, who's not, but I can promise you Javion Cole is going to play a ton, and he's absolutely someone that's going to have to come in for someone like Manny Muhammad or someone like Jahdae Barron at that corner position and play really, really good minutes. And I think the biggest thing for this Texas back end is last year there was a lot of things that just had to fit. There was a lot of things that had to go their way, whether it was the safeties having to come together where it was a relatively young group a year ago, or someone like Manny Muhammad who was a freshman. He had to hit last year. There was no two ways about that for them to have a good pass defense, and he did hit. He was a very good player, but their pass defense definitely struggled because of some of the other problems around. If you can have a guy like Javion Cole come around and be a really, really solid option, whether it's rotational or possibly finding his way into a starting spot, everything else becomes easier. You can move Jahdae Barron all around the field because he's one of those type of players that you can move all around the field. You can give Manny Muhammad a couple more snaps off, or at least give Manny Muhammad a little bit less of that aggressive, wide receiver one every single down of the game. So I think Javion Cole is one of those guys that just opens a lot of doors. I've talked about this before on here, but a lot of the position groups around the country aren't necessarily bad by any means. They usually just need that one person to step up to make everyone else kind of fit into their spots. I think Javion Cole could be one of those guys that if he steps up into that second in that backup spot at one of those corner positions and can play really consistent good football, the entire rest of this back end is really going to benefit a ton from that. Moving on to Georgia, they want that elite defense. There's no two ways about that, and it starts with a guy like Christian Miller to me. When you look at this defensive line, I love Nazir Stackhouse. I really like Warren Brinson. I think they're both really good players. You need more than that, and you need guys that are going to be outright difference makers, and frankly, we saw what Nazir Stackhouse was a year ago. We saw what Warren Brinson was, and I would be surprised if they made enough of a step forward to be those game records that Georgia has had on the defensive front in the past. Christian Miller is a guy that I think could be that. I think he's an absolute monster, super athletic, someone that can totally play pretty much wherever you want him to on the line of scrimmage, whether you want to kick him out to the 3 technique or even to the 4-eye technique, you can do that. If you want to play him inside at the 1 or the 2-eye, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So a very athletic kid, definitely can do a lot of things on the defensive front. Frankly, when I look at this Georgia team, I think Xavier McLeod and him are the two that, at least on that defensive front, that can make this a Georgia defense, that can make this a dominant front that absolutely, controls the pace of the game, the entire game, and could really, really open up so many doors for this defense. So when you look at this top line, I don't necessarily love the defensive tackles at Georgia, but I think you have that athleticism with Christian Miller, with Xavier McLeod on that back end, that if at least one of those guys, I'm tabbing Christian Miller, but it could be Xavier McLeod just as easily. If one of those guys steps up in big ways, then you'll be more than fine on that defensive front. I feel pretty confident about that. And then Johnny Aguero is someone I'm watching very, very closely. He has a ton on his shoulders coming in at that nickel position because the guy that just walked out the door was one of the better at that position that I have ever seen. Javon Bullard was an absolute monster for Georgia. He was everywhere that he needed to be. He was a really hard hitter, could play tight ends in coverage, could play running backs in coverage, did everything that you want a nickel to do, and was a great communicator on top of that. So everything that you needed from him, he did. Johnny Aguero is now stepping in, and you got to be that guy. You're going to have to be an elite communicator. You're going to have to be diverse in the way that you can get around coverages and play the run and do a ton of different things on that side of the ball. But overall, I think when you look at this UGA back end, there are some questions. There are some questions more in the depth than anything else. I like the front line that they have, but they are going to play some young guys with KJ Bolden, with Ellis Robinson III, a ton of guys that are going to have to make some big-time plays. But I think Johnny Aguero, if he can hold down that nickel position, if you don't have to worry about that nickel and you feel confident that he's going to walk into this year and be totally dominant at that position the same way Javon Bullard was a year ago, you'll be fine. It's a total stabilizer for this back end where you have that nickel position, you have your free safety, you feel pretty confident in what Dalen Everett's going to be this upcoming year. I think Daniel Harris, on the other side, and Julian Humphrey is going to be really good players, but overall, you need that catalyst. You need to make sure that as many things are ironclad in this back end as possible, and if Johnny Aguero walks into the season with being as confident as anyone and they feel confident in him, I think this back end is going to be just about as good as you can find across the country. But let's get into Oregon, and Derek Harmon is the guy I want to start with. He has gotten a lot of talk in fall camp, and we'll break that down in the next segment, but he is someone that came over from Michigan State and is huge for this team this upcoming year. He played all 12 games last year for Michigan State, had 10 starting assignments, 40 tackles, definitely made some really good plays, 2.5 sacks. He was around. There's no two ways about that. I think led Michigan State in interior defensive line snaps, so he can play a lot. He doesn't seem like he's going to be the starter. It sounds like Keon Hudson-Ware is going to be the starter at one of those defensive tackle positions next to Jamari Caldwell. But Derek Harmon's going to play, and he's going to play a ton, and frankly, they absolutely need him to be a big-time player. They need him to be that stifling defensive front that he absolutely is capable of being. So when you put together him, Jamari Caldwell, Keon Hudson-Ware, when you have a ton of other, Amari Washington is another defensive tackle over there, they're going to have plenty of guys to throw at you. You need a couple of these guys to really hit big, and frankly, I think Derek Harmon's going to be one of those guys. So I feel pretty good about this defensive tackle group, if I'm being totally honest. I think they have plenty of guys to throw at you, but I think Derek Harmon's going to be one that's going to just have to be huge for this team. And then Oregon's pass defense was a big-time issue in last year, where that was probably the difference between them getting to the playoff and not. When you walk into those Washington games, there were just a couple of plays where this back end just did not look where they needed to be. They did a lot to get that in place, and the biggest one, or not the biggest one, because they brought in Jabbar Muhammad, Cam Alexander, a ton of guys on that back end, but bringing in someone like Sione Luala is a huge pickup. I think this is a guy coming out of JUCO, number 2 JUCO transfer this past year, and was the number 1 guy at the corner position coming out of San Mateo College. But this is someone that usually you would let those guys get up to speed. Usually those guys wouldn't have to play right away, and you'd be able to kind of get them up to speed when it comes to a Power 4 level compared to a JUCO level. It's an entirely different world. So usually they would have some time. That's not necessarily the case this time around. You do have Jabbar Muhammad and Cam Alexander holding down those two spots for the time being, but you're going to need depth. You're going to need Dante Manning. You're going to need Luala. You're going to need some of these guys to really play big-time snaps against some of the Ohio States of the world. And if you can't hold up against them, you're going to have a problem holding up against Texas and holding up against Georgia and holding up against all of the teams that you want to beat and are going to have to beat to win a national title. So someone like Sione Luala, I think, is someone that absolutely is going to be huge for this team, is absolutely going to play big time snaps. And frankly, if you don't want to go over to a ton of freshmen playing on your back end, he's going to be someone that's going to have to be huge for them. So overall, I think they have a ton of guys on that front line that I feel really confident in that back end. The depth I don't necessarily love on that back end. So someone like Sione Luala absolutely is someone that could step into that role. And then you get into Ohio State, one of the teams that everyone's watching very, very closely, and they're watching it for very one reason. It's Will Howard. Everyone wants to know, what is Will Howard going to do in fall camp, and is he going to separate the way that he didn't in spring camp? Because frankly, if I'm being honest, I thought he would have taken it by now. I thought he would have taken full control of this offense. Now, learning a new offense with the OC change that happened a little bit later on in the process than you would have liked obviously plays a part in this, but it definitely adds a little bit of worry to me. We'll get into him in the next segment here, but he has to take full control. It doesn't have to be perfect football. It doesn't have to be, A-plus football start to finish, but he has to know where everyone's going to be. He has to know all of the different reads he has to go through. He has to know, how these guys like to come out of their routes, and how Carnell Tate likes to run over the middle, or how Emeka Egbuka likes to run his comeback routes, how Jeremiah Smith runs the fade and where to put that ball. All of these little things are going to be the difference between Ohio State reaching their goal and not this year. So I do think it's going to be very interesting, but it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect. But I need to go into this season as an Ohio State fan, hypothetically. I need to go into this season saying, if I'm down 7 and with 4 minutes left in Eugene, Oregon, can he orchestrate an offense with him being the main point? Not the wide receivers on the outside, not this incredible running group that you have, with Will Howard at the helm, with Will Howard making all of the plays that need to be made. Is he the guy that is going to be able to do that? So I think walking out of fall camp, you'll know a lot about Will Howard. We won't know everything until the season starts, but absolutely will be a huge fall camp for him just to take control of this position and say that it is his and he will not be dominated by any means this upcoming year. And it's still a big time question as of right now. The other guy I want to touch on is Josh Simmons. He kind of goes with Will Howard because his success is Will Howard's success in a lot of ways. You absolutely have to have this guy be a big-time player for you at that left tackle position, and he was a good player a year ago. There's no two ways about that. He absolutely made some good plays throughout the year, but he wasn't where you needed to be. And he absolutely can develop into a first-round talent type of guy, but it's got to start with a really good fall camp. I do think he's someone that holds a lot in this offense. If they're going to be dominant, then Josh Simmons absolutely has to be dominant. So it'll be fun to watch that kind of develop throughout fall camp. But let's get into fall camp. Let's get into all of the updates that we need to know about fall camp. Right after this break, we'll break down everything you need to know about a ton of different teams around the country because there's so much stuff coming out. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.